In this video, we're going to be discussing the selection tools used in Photoshop. As I explained before, we are going to be introducing just some of the tools that Photoshop offers. We're not going to be utilizing all of them for all of our projects, but these tools that we're going to be using will at least get you started with basics of Photoshop and allow you to develop further knowledge and skills moving forward. In our tool palette notes on page 2, I have identified some of the tools for you, and you were responsible for identifying 6 of them. The selection tools were all identified for you. They're all underneath kind of our sub tools, if you will. The first one that we're going to be talking about is our rectangular marquee tool. And our rectangular marquee tool selects pixels based on a rectangular selection. All right, so all of our selection tools that we're going to be working with, there are 6 of them that we're going to be discussing in this video. Rectangular marquee tool, elliptical marquee tool, lasso, polygonal lasso, magic wand, and quick selection. Those 6 tools help us select pixels, so those little tiny dots of color, in different ways. So what I'm going to do in my layers palette, I have these little eyeball icons. I'm just going to go ahead and click on all of those. Actually, if I just drag straight up, it should let me turn all of those off. That way I'm just working with my background image. Okay, so I'm going to use my background image in this image to go ahead and show you how each of these work. And I'm going to run through these pretty quick, just to give you an idea. So our rectangular marquee tool selects based on rectangular selections. So what you'll do is you'll make some sort of click and drag. You'll create some sort of rectangular shaped selection. And everything inside of this selection that kind of looks like marching ants. It looks like they're moving around and around and around inside that rectangular selection here. And all the pixels inside of this selection are now active. All right. So if I grab my move tool, everything inside, again, of those marching ants or inside of our selection is active. All right, and it's going to go ahead and be selected, and you can change, modify, manipulate, whatever you might need. All right, so I'm going to step back to my rectangular selection in my history palette. If I were to come in with the brush tool that I previously showed you and colored in some of our brush, I'm going to change the brush size here and the hardness. All right, make my brush real big. And then my brush is only going to color in inside of that selection because that's the only thing that is active right now. All right, so our little marching ants represent a selection with the selection tool. And anything inside of the selection, those pixels are the only ones that are going to be active. All right, so I'm going to step back in my history palette so I can undo that selection. If I wanted to get rid of it from here, I could do that too. How you do that is by going up to select, deselect, or control D. That might be something that you want to get into your notes. That's super helpful. We're going to be using this a lot. So again, I'll be reminding you of that shortcut as I use it. If you wanted to use, if you wanted to select everything in your document, you would go to select all, and those marching ants would show up around your entire canvas to select it all. Again, if you want to deselect, you would just go to Control D. All right, the second selection tool is the elliptical marquee tool that is hiding behind your rectangular marquee tool. And this one works very similar to your rectangular marquee tool, only you guessed it, it selects pixels based on a circular selection. So it could be an oval, it could be a perfect circle if you hold the Shift key. All right, so your elliptical marquee tool selects based on circular selections. selects based on circular selections. And again, if I grab my move tool, everything inside of that selection or inside of those marching ants are active, therefore they are selected, and you can manipulate anything that way. I am going to do Control D for deselect. And the next tool that we are going to discuss is your lasso tool. It looks like a little lasso rope. Behind the lasso tool is the polygonal and the magnetic lasso tool. The lasso tool selects based on freehand selection. So I am clicking and dragging. I'm holding my mouse cursor down right now, and then I'll come back to the start. And it'll allow me to select pixels based on a freehand selection. So I can kind of customize a little bit more using the lasso tool because it's based on a freehand selection. Again, everything inside of that selection is active right now. So let's say I wanted to fill this whole thing with blue. I could go to Edit Fill, and I could change my color to blue this way if I wanted to, instead of using the brush tool, and it would fill in that selection. All right. Now let's say I wanted to create this freehand selection, but I wanted everything outside of that selection to be a specific color. I could do that too by going to Select Inverse. That shortcut is Shift plus Control plus I. And this might be something that you also want to get down in your notes underneath your selection tools, in addition to Select All and Select Deselect, because these are three that we're going to be using a whole lot. So Select Inverse, basically what that does is it takes what you have selected and it reverses it. It gives you the opposite. So you're going to notice that my selection kept around this blue purplish figure here. And then you're also now going to see marching ants around the entire canvas. All right, so it's selecting the opposite. So what that looks like is if I were to come in and pick a new color by going to Edit Fill, I could fill in the opposite of my selection, the inverse of my selection, with a color as well. All right, just step back in my history palette because I don't want to keep any of that. The polygonal lasso tool, as a reminder, is right behind the lasso tool. The polygonal lasso tool selects pixels based on a straight edge selection. So I clicked once, clicked twice, and every time I click, it's going to make a hard corner. The only thing with the polygonal lasso tool that we need to remember is we need to come back to our starting point. So you can see I have a little plus sign cursor, and then when I come back to my starting point, there we go, it'll show that polygonal lasso tool symbol again. But what you're going to notice is that there's a little circle in the bottom right-hand corner of that tool to represent that it's closed. All right, and all of the selections that we make with any of our selection tools have to be closed. Otherwise, those marching ants won't appear for us. So I see that little circle, I'm going to click, and it closes my selection. So the polygonal lasso tool selects pixels based on a straight edged selection or a straight lined selection. However you'd like to phrase it, it all means the same exact thing. Straight edge selection. So if you have something like the H symbol, logo, whatever you'd like to call it, in the middle of the football field like we see here, this would be a great tool to kind of come in and trace, because all my lines are straight, right? So I come around the perimeter of this and kind of trace. I'm not doing a very good job for time's sake. If I were doing this for an actual project, I'd be doing a much better job using my zoom tool. All right, but you'll get the idea. And then I'll come back to my starting point. I'll see that close symbol. I'll get all my marching ants. And then if I wanted to fill this in, maybe, I think my computer just froze. Let's try that again. It's not going to let me. That's all right. Oh, it's because nothing is on that layer. I'm not on the right layer. That's why it's not letting me. All right, so let's try that again. edit fill, and then I could change my color if I wanted to. And let's say I want it to be like, ooh, like a lime funky green. All right, we could do that. All right. So again, you can see I still have a little bit of black. It's because I wasn't getting close to my edges. But that is how your polygonal lasso tool works. Your magic wand tool is right below your lasso and your polygonal lasso tool if you have a single column like I do right now. And your magic wand tool is hiding behind your object selection or your quick selection if you can't find them. Shortcut, again, is going to be W. Your magic wand tool selects pixels based on pixel color. So I'm going to go to my background image layer because I need to be able to select the pixels from my background image. All right, and your magic wand tool has this thing called tolerance up in the tool options bar. And the higher the tolerance, the more pixels of similar color it's going to go ahead and select. All right, so I'll show you what this looks like. So I have a tolerance of 100, which is the maximum number that you can grab. And when I click once on red, notice how all these pixels are still selected, even the green ones. All right, so my tolerance, that tells me, is too high. So now, in opposition of that, if I come in with a 20% tolerance and deselect my selection by doing Control D, and I click on my red pixels, with a 20% tolerance, notice how much more selective Photoshop is being with the pixels that it selects. All right, so if it's selecting too many pixels, you'll want to lower your tolerance. If it's not selecting enough pixels, like my situation is right now, I would deselect, and then maybe I need to increase my tolerance. All right, so now that I've increased it, it's selecting more of those red pixels, but it's not selecting all of the red pixels in my image, which is what I'm looking for. So you may need to play with that a little bit. Contiguous up here sometimes is selected. When you deselect it, sometimes you have a better chance of it selecting all continuous red pixels. Doesn't always work out that way. So again, that tool options bar is where we're going to want to come in and change some settings to some of our tools. All right, but your magic wand tool selects pixels based on pixel color. So if I click on the black, it's going to select all the black pixels in my entire document. If I select white, it's going to select anything that resembles a white. My tolerance is kind of in the middle. So I could go higher or lower if I really wanted to, but you get the idea of how that works. The quick selection tool. The quick selection tool selects pixels based on like a painted selection, as I like to call it. The quick selection tool is behind or in front of the magic wand tool. All right. In the quick selection tool, we have different brush sizes. So you can change your brush size up in your tool options bar by moving this little slider here. And we have a hardness, so we could bring down the hardness and it would get soft, kind of like a spray can of spray paint, where it kind of feathers out towards the end. If you bring your hardness all the way to 100%, you're going to get a much more defined selection. All right, so quick selection, I'm clicking and holding my mouse and I'm selecting the clouds, and what you're going to notice is it just kind of jumps randomly as you kind of click, hold, and drag your quick selection tool. Sometimes that's a really nice feature, sometimes it's not. The quick selection tool, I like to say, it has a mind of its own. It just kind of grabs pixels at random. There's not really a rhyme or reason. So be careful with this one, especially if you're working with images that don't have hard lines, kind of like this Huntley H. All right, so I could click and drag, but notice I'm staying on the black, but it's still grabbing some of those white and red pixels. Again, it just kind of has a mind of its own, but for some situations, it is really quick and helpful to select pixels like that. All right, so your quick selection is based on a painted selection. So it selects pixels based on kind of where you click and drag. So however you'd like to phrase that. All right, we talked a little bit about the Move tool, but the Move tool selects and moves different elements on specific layers. So notice I'm on my background image layer because there's actually something on this layer. But if I were to grab a selection and I would put that selection on the HHS logo layer that's hidden right now and try to move it, I'm going to get an error message because there's nothing visible on this layer right now in my document. So if you ever get that, just make sure that you check your layers. All right, so now that I'm back on my background image layer, now that Move tool will move that element or that selection for me. All right, and the Move tool will allow you to move pictures or text or whatever the element is to a new location. But remember, we want each element, like I have, on its own separate layer so you can move each one independently from each other. All right, so I'm going to use the Quick Selection tool real quick, and I made this selection, but now I want to select the rest of this cloud only. But I know if I keep dragging, the Quick Selection tool is going to kind of have a mind of its own. So what we can do, and you're going to see this in our first assignment, what we can do is we can use multiple selection tools at once to select a specific object. All right, and we're going to be using the Shift and Option keys to kind of help us with this. All right, so I don't want to use the Quick Selection tool anymore. Maybe I want to come in and I want to use the Lasso tool. And I want to add on to this marching ant selection that I made from our Quick Selection tool. So if I hold down the Shift key, notice that I'm not holding the Shift key anymore. Now I am. Notice my cursor changes, and there's a little plus sign in the bottom right-hand corner. All right, that plus sign allows you to add to a selection. So I'm holding down the Shift key to add to my selection. And the most important thing that we have to remember is we have to start inside of the marching ants. We want to add on to the selection, so we have to start inside of it. So I'm going to click once inside, and I'm clicking and dragging, and I'm just going to kind of roll my way around that cloud. Remember, we got to close our selection, so I'm going to come towards where I started, and then I'm going to let go. And then once I let go of my mouse, make sure you let go of the mouse first, and then the Shift key, otherwise your selection isn't going to work. All right, but once I let go of my mouse and then the Shift key, notice how my marching ants added to my selection because I was holding down that Shift key. Now, I can do the same thing over here where I have all of this fluff, and then, oh, whoops, oh, shoot, I'm not following that cloud very well anymore. I made a boo-boo. I don't want all of this sky selected. How do I subtract from my selection without starting over? All right, so subtracting from your selection is going to be the Option key or Alt. All right, when you hold down the Option key or the Alt key, Option is in the Mac world, so I think our keyboards are all going to say Alt. What you're going to notice is that you're going to see that minus sign. All right, so I'm holding down the Alt key. It shows up with that minus sign, and now what we can do is we can simply take away, come around our selection, back to our starting point. We can take away from the parts of our image that we don't want selected. All right, I forgot a little fluff here. I can come back in with that selection tool. I can make a new added selection, or again, holding that Alt or Option key, you can take away from it. And I can come in with the polygonal lasso tool and I can add to my selection. So maybe I wanted to do the stadium. I would come down here. And even though I'm not adding to this original selection, I'm still adding to an existing selection that's already been made. So I can kind of customize adding to a different part of my image. And then let's say I want to fill that in with a specific color. Both of those selections would then fill in with a specific color, or Command Z. If I come in with the Move tool, both of those would be moved. So we can add and subtract from our selections very easily. Adding to your selection is the shift key, and then subtracting from your selection is the option key on a Mac or alt on a PC for us. So those are our selection tools that we're going to be using over the course of our Photoshop unit to do the majority of our assignments. Again, I might show you a new tool here and there, but primarily we are going to focus on those selection tools to edit and manipulate our photographs.